So I will just welcome everybody to this event. My name is Matthew Flinders. I am a professor of politics at the University of Sheffield and vice president of the Political Studies Association. We are here today to discuss the study of democracy, how we do it, why it matters theoretically and empirically. And we are really, really lucky to have a great panel to go through this discussion. And the hook or the focus of today's online seminar is a piece of work by Jean-Paul Gagnon called The Study of Democracy, in which he calls for the creation of a large typology or a data mountain of different adjectives, different forms of democracy, so we can understand in greater detail the whole rather than just the part. I was reading one of the response blogs, of which there are now 40 online, which described Jean-Paul as the Indiana Jones of political theory. And I thought, well, you know, I've been called a lot of things, but never Indiana Jones. So well done, JP, for that. So the way today is going to run is we have quite a big, large online audience. Everybody is very welcome. Thank you to ECPR for hosting us and arranging this event. We are going to have an interactive discussion. We're going to start with Jean-Paul, JP. He's going to have 20 minutes to present and outline his broad thesis and also respond to a few of the response criticisms that have been made. We'll then have a few minutes of discussion, and then we're going to come to Petra Guasti, who will offer her thoughts, perspectives, and provocations on JP's arguments. We'll then go to Yutang, who will offer his own perspectives, followed by some more discussion, and we'll finish with Gergana Dimova, again offering some critique, polite provocations. But all the way through as chair, I will be looking for hands up. I'll be monitoring the chat box, and I'll be very keen for people to jump in and ask questions, so we have more of a conversation than a traditional seminar of listening to lots of different papers. Normal sort of etiquette applies. Please keep your microphone on mute, and then I will ask you to either come online or I'll read out from the text box. Put your hand up electronically or wave at me if you've got your video on, and I'll try to come to as many as you as possible. One important thing is this blog debate seems to have really stimulated a lot of interest across the broader international community. We now have a debate consisting of 40 blogs, essays. We have another 20 or 30 in the pipeline, such as the debate that's been created. And ECPR are very keen for more people to join the debate. So if you think there is an issue or a theme or a point that you don't agree with or that we're missing, please feel free to contact ECPR and put in a pitch to the loop to have your contribution published in this long debate. Now, if that sounds okay, I'll just once again welcome everybody online. I'll underline my emphasis on inclusion, and I will invite Jean-Paul to take the floor for no more than 20 minutes to offer us an introduction around his landscape.
Thank you very much, Matthew. And the sun has come through in Toronto, providing me with, well, war paint, I guess. I'm not sure how to deal with the glare, but there you are. I'll share my slides and we will get going. So please do let me know once you see the presentation. Is that viewable?
Yes, got it.
Beautiful. Okay. So, there we are. Let's begin with the proposition. And by the way, I am Jean-Paul of the University of Canberra. Now, in June of last year, my long-read essay, Words of Democracy, Rescuing an Abandoned Science, was published by the Religion and Ethics section of the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. It's a great platform for philosophers and theorists to pitch to, and their lead, Scott Stevens, is a nurturing and collaborative editor. So please, everyone, do keep religion and ethics in mind as a potential publisher for you. Scott invited me with carte blanche to write my, quote, best possible essay on democracy, end quote, and so I tried. At the point of his invitation, I had been investigating, feeling more like a tracker of certain claims that I had been coming across in both historical and contemporary works on democracy. These were that there are, in effect, many forms or meanings of it. You can, in fact, track these statements every decade from today back into the early 1600s. So for every 10 years, across more than 4 centuries, someone, including Alexandre Dumas, has had a statement pertaining to democracy's variable nature published. This supposition of democracy's many forms or meanings is therefore certainly not new. In fact, the Norwegian philosopher Arnaes claimed that Aristotle gave no less than 7 definitions of democracy in his Politics, and classicists, but also archaeoanthropologists, have given details of democratic variants in their own works. So this many forms of democracy, if you like, positions, is very old. Now, I haven't been able to bridge the gap decade to decade between the 16th century and the classical period, but I suspect that that has more to do with lack of access to manuscripts than a break in the making of such statements about democracy. I think that way because it's common practice. If you want to say something about something, it's often logical to start your reader with what you know about the thing, even if that's just a hunch about its variants, and then to move on from there. That, I wager, is our conventional approach to studying democracy, which can be explained through the Italian-American political scientist Giovanni Sartori. He explains that this conventional approach to the study of democracy has produced a field that is characterized as nothing more than, quote, splendid fragments in splendid isolation, end quote. The workers in the field consequently conduct their efforts in an age of, quote, confusion, end quote, about democracy, an age, crucially, of their own making, because we haven't started from our best approximations of democracy's many forms or meanings in the world. We rather start from our preferred theories, some of which dominate the many others. So yes, we do have a 99% problem among the theories of democracy. Most are neglected, unknown, and forgotten. And we can talk about why that's the case in the discussions to follow, if you like. Now I'm getting a bit ahead of myself, so let's take a step back and revisit the point. So the point here is that at the time of Scott's invitation, I found this centuries-long string of claims that democracy has many forms or means many things, but I wasn't able to find an exhaustive account of its supposed forms or meanings. And as I just said, starting with that account is just not how we have conventionally studied democracy. Our tendency is to begin with a strong theory about the thing without first setting out what the possibilities of the thing are in the world, descriptively, empirically, across times and spaces, cultures, and languages. So I set out to try to investigate this issue in the religion and ethics essay, and did try to begin making sense of just such an approach. What's in that essay of mine, which is more extensively detailed in the book I'm writing, called Democracy's Linguistic Artifacts, is, of course, the claim that we haven't moved beyond these repeated hunches about democracy's many forms and its many meanings, and have not, as a consequence, done our basic research on democracy before theorizing about it. Hans Ozenbaum of the Center of Deliberative Democracy, based at the University of Canberra, termed this action a disciplining, quote, sorry, disciplining of the discipline, end quote. And I suppose that may be the outcome of the essay and why it has instigated this level of interest from a diverse array of scholars. The response from colleagues to date has been difficult to keep up with. I never expected it would grow like this. The level of intellectual engagement that my proposition has received is, of course, very humbling, as you get to learn from incredible minds, to fawn, as I have many times, over their beautifully crafted sentences, and to spend weeks thinking about their ideas. Sometimes that's an idyllic outcome, and sometimes it can be very challenging. Either way, I do, of course, cherish this outcome very deeply. It's an incredible gift to be able to read and think in society.
Va bene, dai.
Pardon. It's just basically a wonderful outcome. So it's also simultaneously very uncomfortable. And I say this because it's becoming clearer to me that my proposal may carry with it the risks of undermining efforts by the prize fighters for, or schools of, certain models of democracy, such as liberal, representative, electoral, and deliberative. They are each hard up in the fight against autocracy and authoritarianism, but also against plutocratic oligarchs, theologically driven despots, and frankly, a despondency among Democrats who are potentially losing faith in these democratic projects. And these Democrats of losing faith are casting, we're told, hungry eyes at the less or non-democratic alternatives as exist in our finite ecology of the governances. I don't think conducting basic research on democracy intends to weaken any model of it, or that it will actually produce such an effect, but it's there as a concern nonetheless, particularly from Christopher Hobson of the Australian National University, who mounts a laudable defense of liberal democracy in his essay for The Loop. That said, the more than 40 essays that have been penned to date do critically develop ideas out of my proposal, and they are together producing a much richer and clearer picture of how we might go about capturing the forms and meanings of democracy in the world, how we should organize and study this enormous data, and what we should aim to produce as service, as institution out of this work. So please do set some time aside, if you haven't already, to read through the discussion. I'm encouraging an early jump, if you like, into the series, as there are more essays to come, as Matthew mentioned, this year and possibly into next year. Certainly so if some of you decide to contribute your own thoughts to this exciting series by The Loop. Sometimes authors share their essays with me ahead of publication, so I can here offer a glimpse of what still may come. Just as there is concern over the amount of information that can be found on democracy, even without using that word, as Kathleen McCrudden of the European University Institute points out, there is too concern over what is missing from the gatherable information altogether. For example, if the statist and demogenic natures of democracy in a city are your concern, so for the statist position, it would be Warsaw's democracy, and for the demogenic position, it would be Varshavian democracy, you would likely check out the literature that exists on such terms and then conduct fieldwork to build on what's there. Oftentimes, however, nothing, not one result, will come back from the literature on such terms. There are, if you use this terminological approach, lacunae everywhere. So what we gather is, even in its enormity in terms of data that can be collected about democracy across times, spaces, cultures, and languages, likely mere fragment, and therefore revelator of more investigations that need to be done, investigations that get us out of the archive and into the field. Now, what makes this abundantly clear to me, and what several contributors to the Loop series on this science of democracy have already pointed out in their own ways, is that my proposition is but a mere stepping stone, as Martin Hammersley of the Open University cautions. And given my love for Taoism, that outcome pleases me greatly. Now to reflections on what's been said. What are we stepping toward? First, I think, is the acceptance that democracy does indeed undeniably mean a great many things and this can, in fact, generate a great many democratic outcomes. Crucially, however, we need to approach this understanding without putting all of our weight on the word democracy alone. Lawrence Whitehead of Nuffield College, Oxford, Chiyu Shi of Taiwan National University, Ryusaku Yamada of Soka University, and Sorhun Tan of the Singapore Management University, each reveal in their own ways that democracies, including their equivalents within their own distinct cultural anchors, as Frederick Schaeffer might say, do exist in the world. I loved Lawrence's point, echoed by Fred in a forthcoming collaboration of ours outside of the Loop series, which is that these equivalences are mutually intelligible. We have just got to do the work of understanding them and seeing if their approaches to, say, Manapuri or Minju or Demokrasi, pardon my pronunciation, or Demokratia may appeal to the us, to the we that use the word democracy, or vice versa. Second, there has been a great contribution to matters of organizing these data points of democracy. Andre Bechtiger of Stuttgart University proposes a living museum. Luke Temple of Sheffield University proposes an open wiki. Petra Guasti of Charles University in Here Today proposes an encyclopedia. Marcus Pausch of Salzburg University a dictionary. Ernesto Cruz of TUM in Munich a digital equivalent of a specimen drawer for democracy. And on the proposals go. You can uncover.
D'accord, ma chérie.
Je peux t'avoir des AirPods ou t'en as besoin?
D'accord.
Pardon. And you can uncover more proposals by reading through the Loop series of essays on this topic, which is also known as the Butterfly series. Third, the method for creating these platforms and means for presentation has also been contributed to greatly. Aina Mary Lowodo of the University of Helsinki places focus on the values held inside different conceptions of democracy. Kyung-Min Sun of the University of Delaware urges focus on how concepts of democracy destabilize themselves through their perpetual reinvention, and says that we need to keep tracking this. Hans Ozenbaum points to diverse peoples as a source of democracies to draw from. Matthew Flinders, our gallant host, highlights that our work may produce multiple, irreducible, and irreconcilable theories of democracy. So it's not a singular theory that we're after. Frank Hendricks of Tilburg University argues that each data point of democracy must take into account how its uptake or lack thereof is driven by variation and selection. Christian Evert at the University of Zurich says that each of democracy's data points will likely have a narrative to it, and so we've got to tell their stories. So there's very much work to be done here. Crucially, and I want to lay great stress on this point, this is work that we're not presently doing, not at this scale, not in this approach. Consequently, I think this work is exploratory and exciting. We can talk more about the, let's say, veracity of that claim. Lastly, in terms of need, for Alexander Hudson of the International IDEA, which is a global pro-democracy institution, the science of democracy, characterized here as basic research on the democracies as can be found in the world across times, spaces, languages, and cultures, and their study and presentation back to the world, can help us detect these democracies and, as with butterflies, find which ones are under threat so that we can run to their aid. Then Ricky Dean of Goethe University in Frankfurt says the science of democracy can help us identify the, quote, pressure points, end quote, of democracy in the world. And I think Tetsuki Tamura's essay exhibits perfectly that point with his focus on democratizing the family, or Danica Floiss's essay, which postulates that our work may help to decolonize democratic theories and practices. Then you've got Sandra Field from Yale and US, who supposes that this science could lead to finding overlaps and interconnections between conceptions of democracy, which could trigger new questions or theories for researchers. I think Norma Osterberg, Kaufman, and colleagues' essay, along with Michael Sayward's, and Agustin Goenaga's own contribution to the Loop series also point to provocative directions. How, for instance, can we use a much more detailed and arguably better starting position on what we know of democracy to design democratic projects today? What fabrics of democracy can we make out of it? Or how can we reinvent democracy for the future from it? And then there are contributions from Paula Sablov of the Santa Fe Institute, a think tank, on how the science of democracy can bring more dignity to a greater number of peoples, or Trish Roberts-Miller's point that not pursuing the science can lead to the destruction of actually existing democracies. Martin Keim says that the science of democracy may lead to more cautious theory building of democracy, which can change the nature of democracy promotion globally, especially making it less one-sided. Leonardo Morlino of Luis has actually posited a means for doing this in the Loop series through surveys. Further, Kei Nishiyama from Doshisha University describes how the science of democracy can lead to innovations in teaching democracy. Eva Chernyavsky, I'm getting breathless, from the University of Washington, Seattle, explains how having this stronger understanding of what democracy means can empower pro-democracy activists in the world. And lastly, in terms of needs, Gergana Dimova of Florida State, who's with us here today, explains how our work can lead to more cooperation between academic disciplines, which may in itself lead to new, presently unimaginable possibilities in the study of democracy and its practices in the future. There is a sense of flowers blooming here. Speeding along, time is running out. I'll end with considerations that have come out of the essays that are more critical or suspicious, if you like, of my proposal. Andrea Felicetti of the Scuola Normale Superiore defends the status quo of conventional democratic theory that I critique in my essay. He does so, I think, because in conventional strong theory, there is certainty over what democracy means and what democracy does not mean. That's a great entry point to a number of other essays by Maya Satala from Turku University, John Min from the University of Nevada, Tom Thims from Leiden University, Benjamin Abrahams from University College London, and Eva Crick from the University of Mainz, as each evoke in their own critical approaches the inherent tension, the elephant in the room, the wrench in the science, which is that you've got to know to demarcate what democracy is before you can go about capturing it. If not that, then surely anything goes. My response to this tension is a compromise, as I still think we need to be as capacious and inclusive as possible at first, and then, through interrogation, eliminate the imposter concepts, the false positives of democracy, to try to rid our data of new and sneaky despots, as John Keane might say, except with better phrasing, of course. We need to do this to ensure our data sets on what democracy means contains a sufficient minimum of what Helene Landemore might call democraticity in this instance. And that compromises the creation of an international commission led by a large and diverse body of democracies, epistocrats, pace, forgive me, whose job it is to perform the policing duty of what can enter the, quote, things democratic box, end quote, and what cannot. That's, as you can imagine, an astoundingly difficult philosophical undertaking, as on the one hand, it's not very democratic to have the epistocracy police saying what's what, but then on the other hand, can we conduct the science of democracy without it? I would love to hear Simone Chambers's, Amy Allen's, Danielle Allen's, John Dryzik's, or John Parkinson's and Nadia Urbinati's take on this. I mean, goodness, if Karl Popper or Isaiah Berlin were still with us. Anyway, that's probably a good place for me to end. So I will finish on that note. And I do thank everyone very much for this chance to share my thoughts. I hope there was something in this for you. If not, I beg pardon, but rest assured, our co-panelists won't fail to capture your imagination. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Jean-Paul, not just for giving us such an eloquent view of your core thesis, but also of blending that review of your thesis with some of the responses from the various contributors to the debate. What I'm keen to do now is to just create a little space for some initial observations from the audience. So if anybody would like to come in with a question or brief point, I'd welcome people to raise their hand now and I'll come to you. While people are thinking about those points, JP, I've got a question for you just to sort of get things going. How many butterflies do you currently have in your specimen drawers?
Well, the series has redirected my attention from the basic work of counting, of capturing, but at last count it was 4,184 individual linguistic artifacts or butterflies in this terminology. That number seems, I think, it's my hunch that it's a lot bigger than it would necessarily need to be, because I think there is a large degree of conceptual overlap between these terms. So you'll have, 30 or 40 different pairings of words. Sometimes they're more than that. So you'll get an initial pairing of representative democracy. And if you think of that as a house, in fact, you can think of all of these linguistic artifacts as buildings. And if you put them in a virtual city or a city of your imagination in your mind, each of them is a different building, and size is dictated by the amount of times, again, it's very crude, but the amount of times those terms are used in literature. So representative democracy is a huge cathedral. Deliberative democracy, it's a modern skyscraper. And when you look at the sub forms, you might have liberal representative democracy, or neo-patrimonial and so forth. These then form rooms, distinct rooms inside those buildings. And you can start to order it quite basically that way.
Okay, let's come back to that ordering. I'm keen to bring people in from the audience. Anybody, please feel free to put your hand. I'm going to invite Hans Ozenbaum to come in with a contribution. Hans?
Yeah, hello everyone. Thanks for the presentation, JP. I thought it was beautiful as always. So I think your passion for collecting is really admirable, and this passion of collecting the many meanings of democracy is then again reflected in your passion for collecting our essays now. So thanks for facilitating this. Thanks for bringing all these different voices together. I was wondering, and I feel like you've touched on this point, but I want to push this a bit further. I was wondering where all of this is going. So once we have all these many meanings of democracy, seemingly endless meanings of democracy, once we have all that, and however we organize them in a database or in another way, where does this lead us? Is there any result? Is there any product? Is there any synthesis? What can we learn from this? So where does all of this go is one point. And the other point then is, if there are so many, maybe even endless meanings of democracy, and we bring all of them together, does democracy still mean anything? Doesn't democracy in a way lose its meaning if it can mean anything? So those are my 2 points that I wanted to ask. And yeah, thanks again for doing all of this work.
Thank you, Hans, very, very much for your question. Very quickly, in terms of where it's going, when I first wrote the essay, I admit I wrote it just as an offering. That's all it is. And the book, Democracy's Linguistic Artifacts, is just some ideas that I had of what could be made from that. From the series, it's becoming, I think, abundantly clear that there's a thirst for references, right? Products that would be things like encyclopedias, dictionaries, specimen drawers, digital cities, which I write about in the book. And these types of things, in them, there's the hope that they will be of use to those who would like to democratize something somewhere in their lives, in their worldview. That doesn't have to be political. It could be, trying to democratize the family or the school or the workplace, these possibilities are growing for us, including in terms of economy. So that's one thing. I think the products are definitely going to be points of reference for the various types of democracy. And as I said before, I think we've got a big challenge philosophically ahead of us as to, well, what qualifies as being sufficiently democratic. Then there are matters of presentation. You know, I think Andre Bechtiger, I think his essay was really good in terms of trying to take these various inceptions, invocations of democracy, which importantly appear to have evolved or been created independently of each other. It's something that is very contrarian to a dominant thesis of democracy, and that it was born in ancient Athens. Anyone who studied classics would know that there was a variety of different approaches to democracy contemporaneously for that period. And so this thesis that there is this line of democracy's birth in Athens, and I'm not meaning to ruin the tourism industry over there at all, I'm just saying it's a specious claim. And then maintaining that this line was then developed through Rome and republics in Italy and Germany and Switzerland, and then taken up in the UK and beautified and perfected through French and British and American empires. That's just a mere fragment, right? Just as this work that we're doing in expanding the meanings, I wouldn't even say expanding, just revealing. I mean, they're there. We're not inventing this. This is not an act of neology. It's literally just an act of uncovery, of dusting things off and trying to make sense of them. When we do that, we have a lot more potential, and presenting these potentials through, as Andre said, some kind of living museum or a living archive, that then spawns other unknowable possibilities. You know, the curator only hopes that you could provide some, you know, form of inspiration to others that may have compounding effects in their lives and therefore into society or politics, and you hope in the end for better outcomes. Yeah, it's nebulous, but that's as far as I could get at the moment. And then to finish, in terms of a total texture, in terms of what happens when we've got all of, I mean, it'll never be all of, but once we've got a lot of this information that we know about in a much better state of organization, and we have the software, the computational means for manipulating that data, be it a digital city or whatnot, then are we going to end up with a singular theory of democracy? I don't know. I think my hunch is that we're going to end up with a number of irreconcilable minimums, and that these will each mean sufficiently democratic things to those that have breathed life into it, into those theories across time and space and culture and language. Is that going to quell the model wars? Certainly not. Is that going to provide us with, I think, an energy boost in friendly contestation, right, in the sport of the democracies? Perhaps. And is that going to be a good thing? I think undeniably so. So to those who have,
JP, let me step in to offer another boost. I'm going to move things along in terms of curating this conversation. I'm going to invite our first panel member, Petra Guasti, to make some fairly brief comments to continue and develop this line of conversation. So Petra, over to you, please.
Okay, I have to unmute myself. Thank you, Matt. I would like to thank Matthew for organizing us and for providing us the initial questions. I want to thank the ECPR for providing us the platform, and I want to thank all of you for being here today. And of course, first and last but not least, but also foremost, I would like to thank Jean-Paul for starting this. I love to see Jean-Paul as somebody who has provided a breath of fresh air and single-handedly trying to build the science of democracy, and it's a great pleasure and honor to take part in it. I would like to start with the metaphor of a butterfly. I like metaphors and I love butterflies. And I think that in terms of democracy, we don't live in ivory towers, and the towers around, a lot of things around us these days seem to be crumbling. And so I would like to start with 2 points. I want to say that democracy is fragile. It's like a butterfly. It's every day species are getting extinct. So we must be aware that democracy can die and that it can be suffocated by conflict, war, or simple ignorance if we don't care. And that's why I've selected a picture of a child's hand holding the butterfly. And I also want to acknowledge that democracy is currently under attack, that it's not something we get and we have. It's something that people in Kiev and in Kharkov are dying for. And it's not a metaphor. I don't mean it metaphorically, I mean it literally. And I thought this needs to be said before I return to the ivory tower with you. The Science of Democracy, in his essay, Jean-Paul opens up a very rich and multifaceted debate. It's a mapping, it's a map, I would say, of a journey for discovering the total texture of democracy. So that is the end goal, kind of. So it's the belief that there could be, that there is more to democracy than we know, that there is more in different historical contexts, in different linguistic concepts, contexts, and that there is simply more. I think that what's really laudable about Jean-Paul, and why he is, in my opinion, perfect person for this, is because he's a real pluralist and such an open person. And so it has never been in his writing a hierarchical exercise. And I think this is really important. We need to decolonize political science, and it's such a pleasure to keep on discovering all these new concepts we didn't know anything about. And I think it's also a big challenge to the prevalent notions. And the reason, in my opinion, or one of the reasons why this debate has so reverberated through our community, is because we are all aware that working with a simple, minimal definition, or trying to join one or the other camp in the model wars is not all, that it's more a necessity rather than that we have arrived at a point in which we are comfortable. So in my contribution, I have proposed a taxonomy for democratic theory. And in preparation for this discussion, Matt told us to critically review our own work and revisit it. And so here it is. So in the essay, I think that I didn't go far enough. And I think that I didn't let my mind go to all the places it wanted to. What I think is that we must move beyond a hierarchy. So I kind of my starting point was Linné's system of species, and I try to look whether we could find something similar like that for democracy. And I think it is too hierarchical. So we would need to be more horizontal, more free about that. But still, I think the core features for the taxonomy are still at hand, and that is the search for democracy. So what I would call a democratic core. Perhaps after today, I could be happy with cores, but I think there must be something. While we need to go beyond democracy and undemocracy, we still need to get into values and how to distinguish what we are talking about from the other things, and whether it's going to be through a committee of epistocrats or through a survey, I don't know, and I will leave that to others who have proposed these great ideas, but I think we need to dig for it. And just that we don't have it now and we don't have it yet, or we couldn't yet imagine it completely, or we don't have an agreement, doesn't mean we should stop looking. I think we also need to I proposed also to identify criteria for classes, orders, and genera, so kind of to follow the Linnean system. And I think that after reading all the contribution, especially by Hans, for example, that and also being more like considering the time we are living in, I think we, in our creation of the taxonomy, should not be just by epistocrats. I think that we need to look not only how the authors defined their concepts of democracy or similar concepts, but we need to also look at the meaning people assign to democracy, and their lived experiences need to be also considered. So in effect, I think it would be important to incorporate meaning across time, from academic everyday to be context sensitive. And I think most importantly, to co-create together this encyclopedia or taxonomy. So what I proposed, and many others did, was building an encyclopedia of democracies. And it should be a joint exercise between scholars and practitioners, and with the biggest stress on co-creation, so doing it together. I think the challenge there for us is to recognize the complex texture and to try to search for perhaps universal, but most of all communicable concept of democracy. We cannot do this in ivory tower. We should do it in the streets and perhaps in the squares, in cooperation with the citizens, because if they don't understand what we mean, then what is our exercise for? So I think the search for the democratic core should not only take place in libraries and archives, but also in everywhere where people live together peacefully. I think our aim should go beyond concepts and meaning. It's also, as Matthew in his essay considered, and which I find really urgent these days, is looking for ways to defend democracy. And I think that way is not in providing one definition that is going to be ultimate and that's at the same time going to be easy to operationalize and study in quantitative and qualitative way. I think what we need to do is to revitalize democracy, its dynamics, and to remind ourselves and to everybody around us the emancipatory promise which is at the heart of democracy. And if I can, I would thank you for your attention and end here.
Thank you ever so much for that, Petra. People at home watching online, I'm very, very keen for people to put their hands up and to come in and ask questions or put any notes in the chat. Following on from Petra, and while people hopefully put their hands up, JP, I've got a question for you. Petra mentioned what is existing at the core of this concept we're calling democracy. What for you is at the core, and what does this relate to your focus on tone and texture, in brief?
In brief, my hunch is that this thing called democracy or democracia or manipori occurs when minimum two agents are trying to do something. Now, that provides an incredible diversity of possibilities. Again, in brief, consider, I believe it's Herman Hermans or Hubert Hermans, forgive me for forgetting his name, but his work was republished in English through Oxford called Inner Democracy, and that was in 2021. He's a psychologist, and his proposal is for us to democratize our psychological or psychogenic selves. And I've been trying to do this. It's very difficult, but that counts. So you literally, this is called the island game. And a former student of mine has developed this into a teaching program that he uses in his classrooms with younger people. And so you have a bare island and you ask yourself, can any form of democracy live here? Outside of non-human democracy, the answer could, well, be no. You put one person on there, then you have at least Herman's proposal for inner democracy. You add another person, and then you can start getting other possibilities of democracy in practice. So as long as you have these two agents trying to do something, you have the possibility of doing that in some way democratic versus the opposing side. For Herman's, this is the indomitable authoritarian will that's, he argues, many of us have inside of ourselves, that if you hear something, you have an engagement with somebody you disagree with. Here in Toronto, there were the quote unquote truckers, the protesters and such. You know, you have an engagement with one of these people, and you would say sometimes you have this view inside yourself that they are wrong, you are right, and that's the end of the story. He encourages the opposite. Yes, thank you.
Okay, just on that, a very good book published just last week by Cambridge called The Psychology of Democracy, I would point people towards. I'm going to come to Nicholas first and then to Paul Whiteley. So Nicholas, do you want to come online and make a comment or ask a question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Matthew, and thank you so much, Jean-Paul, for your presentation. I do not know if, well, I just lost my connection a couple of minutes, and I do not know if you have addressed this topic before. I do not know if you mentioned the work done by Gallier, the essentially contested concepts, and he put democracy there. And well, for the audience, his opinion, his thesis is that the problem with democracy is that first, always is going to be contested, but it's not. That's not good news, or that's not new news. But the news is that the concept is because of its essentials, and that the problem is that maybe we can have a lot of meanings of corruption, of course, of democracy, but each definition also recognizes the other as some kind of valid. Then what I am saying is, he said that maybe we can have other meanings of corruption, but nobody can say that the definition of the other is not valid. Maybe it's another one, is different and cannot deny it completely. Then for him, the core definition is rule by and for the people. And the debates just begin when we try to understand what is ruling, what is rule, and what is people, and of course, if it is feasible or not. Taking into account your work, I just wanted to know, what do you think about this thesis, and if it goes with your line of work? And thank you so much again for your presentation and for the organizers for the event.
JP, before you do that, I want to bring in Paul Whiteley and grab his question too, please. Paul, great to see you.
Sorry, I just had to unmute myself. Thanks, Matt. I think it's actually quite a good idea to have a taxonomy of the meanings of democracy. But I think we can, it also would be a good idea to link up with existing taxonomies. And I mentioned this because the Varieties of Democracy database has just been updated. That's from the Varieties of Democracy Institute, which many of you will have heard about. And they've just released a new report. And this is measures of various kinds of democracy. And actually, the issue that was referred to earlier of democracy being in trouble is worse than we think. Because I was just looking at the latest report just out. They say that levels of democracy across the world, and they're looking at the whole world, in 2021 are now down to those levels that were present in 1989. So the last 30 years of democratic advances have now been eradicated. Second thing is 70% of the world's population lives now under authoritarian systems of various kinds. They call it dictatorship, but these are varied, of course. So democracy is a minority exercise and shrinking. Third point, the European Union may be facing its own wave of autocratization. 20% of members are, as they describe it, autocratizing. So the whole thing is really very serious. And of course, our attention has been drawn to this by what's been happening in the Ukraine. But I think if we could link up behavioral measures of this kind to this taxonomy, that would be a very useful way of proceeding. And indeed, with some big data analysis, it may be possible to map them, you know, conceptions of democracy mapped to behavioral ones. So I think that might be a useful way forward. But as to the validity of looking at conceptual definitions, I think it's a very good idea. So I'd like to, you know, hear what people think about that.
Okay, great. JP, do you want to offer a very quick response on those 2 points?
Yes, I'll be very quick, and I'd love to hear actually from Petra more, because I've spoken so much already. To Nicolas, the point with Gali, yeah, I mean, in reading his work and in thinking about what UNESCO tried to do in 1948, 49 with its survey of say what democracy means, and they did this to try to cool the contestation between what the Soviet Union claimed it to be and what the American Empire claimed it to be. And then Arnais's work on that survey, what this revealed to me is that having a contestable core set of cores is actually a good thing. And that it's like the definition of the model wars, and that we have, forgive me for the pop culture reference, but it's like a kung fu movie. You've got different grandmasters, different traditions, different conventions, different schools and pupils that follow these things, and they're all, you know, considered a martial art, and they're all done for typically a salubrious purpose. And I think, you know, what Andrea Felicetti in particular argued, that there is this extreme good in the strong theory approach to democracy. I think that good is there, that you have this certainty that this at least is democratic to a sufficient number of people, and we're going to keep trying to improve that model, and we're going to keep trying to contest or partner with, right, to struggle against or struggle with different conceptions of democracy, because that, as Paul mentioned, is extremely necessary in an age when, as VDEM, you know, the work is incredible and so detailed and careful, that if we're in the minority position and our gains are eroding, then all of this, everything that we're discussing, is vital. So please let me turn over to Petra, because like I said, I've spoken already too much. Thank you.
Petra, come in, please.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Jean-Paul, and thank you, Paul. If I may, I completely agree with you. I think I'm a weird kind of democratic theorist, because I never wanted to really choose between theory and empirics. I just think they need to come hand in hand. We need each other, because if the empiricists don't have us, as in democratic theories, they end up going with Schumpeter at the end of the day, because the data is there. So I think we need to really be imaginative and work together, and it doesn't always have to be that we need to agree. As for me, I am extremely concerned. I'm extremely concerned with what's going on around in the world, and I think there are two challenges. The one challenge is that of the authoritarian regimes, but I think also what they are doing, this instrumentalization, that they are saying that what they have is democracy. And I think this was in some of the Loop contribution, that was the fear, that if we don't provide one concept, we cannot defend it. But I think that it's kind of having a little bit skeptic is showing some skepticism towards ordinary people, as if they could, like, if you don't provide them a three-word definition, they cannot do it. And I think they can. And I think we need to engage them. You won't save democracy by saying it's just this and nothing else. I think you can save it by saying that there is some core, there are some things at the core which need to be there. I don't know what they are exactly for me personally, but it's defined by where I come from and my past of being born in a non-democracy, in an authoritarian regime. For me, it's always freedom, but it's not just positive, but it's also negative freedom. It's freedom from and freedom to. But there is also a peaceful coexistence. But in peaceful coexistence, and I think the way we could, so we need to at the same time stabilize it and allow it to be flexible, to adapt to these various contexts. And I think we could do it by exactly embracing Gagnon, saying, yes, it is essentially contested, and that's fine. We are embracing it. It is, we can live with this plurality as long as we maintain a peaceful coexistence of free beings, but not just being. I use the concept of peaceful coexistence because it allows me to include not just human beings, but it's peaceful coexistence between human beings and nature, between us and the planet, and that for me is all part of democracy. But I'm completely open to being challenged on that, and I thank Jean-Paul for his invitation to think about these matters. Thank you.
Okay, now I'm keen to include as many people as possible. Mauricio, you had your hand up. Please, I'm very keen to pull you back in. Don't put your hand down.
Okay,
What would you like to say?
Can you hear me fine?
Perfect.
Okay, so I first of all want to say that John Paul's piece was very, I mean, I share his concern about taking away the arbitrariness of the study of democracy. And I read through the whole series over the past weeks. So throughout these readings, I just wanted to make one point that there is like different analytical objectives of the different authors, and I bundled them into 4 categories. So the first one is the normative debates, and that's what Marcus, Agustin, and Kim Min Song talk about. But the other one is the conceptual foundations and how John Paul Gagnon thinks that through the empirical means we can use data as text, text as data to create the meanings of democracy. This has to do with this technique of computer science that basically you can have text as data and then give it a lot of attributes, and then you can cluster them. And you have these different clusters of concepts of democracy that bundle depending on different attributes. But you also have these other conceptual bases that, by looking what people think of democracy, you can come up with a concept of democracy and so on. And the other one is the historical trajectory of the concept, like making a genealogy of how democracy has evolved through time and the historical means and the spatial embeddings of this. And I think that all of these are important projects, but we need to put these analytical lenses before taking into the project. So what do we want to have at the end of the day? And for me, I think that the democratic as a political project, which is that we all care about, implies a little bit of all of these. But if we don't set our goals straight, like we cannot really define like, we want to do this. Like we want to know what are the linguistic differences of democracy. But maybe we care about the political project, and that involves more looking at what the people are talking about. So I just thought that maybe having some analytical clarity for the project will be more beneficial for even different projects, like not just one, but different projects that work at the same time.
Thank you, Mauricio. Sounds like you've been doing some heavy study on this series of debates, and sounds like you have a blog in the offing there. Thank you. I'm going to just remind you, Paul mentioned something interesting about VDEM. The report is in the chat. I also just remembered that Paul will know this, the Trilateral Commission's famous report or infamous report on the crisis of democracy will be 50 years old in 2025. I wonder if that might provide us as a community of scholars online today with something of a target or an anniversary or a reference point that we might think about pulling some of this together in a really profitable way, maybe something to discuss. I'm going to move us on to Yutang, who is going to come on now and offer just 7-8 minutes of his views on developing the conversation that's already started so well. So Yutang, thank you for being here, and over to you.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Matt, for chairing and moderating the panel, and thank you to Roundtable for inviting me to join the panel discussion. It is indeed my great honor to join discussion with Petra and Gergana to comment on Roundtable's work. So what I'm going to say is actually has been kind of touched upon here and there in the previous comments, but I will just offer my distinctive take on JP's work. So Roundtable's effort to steer the status democratic theory in a radically new direction, as far as I can see, is brave and laudable in equal measure, and he attempts to make better approximations of what it is that we know about democracy, its total texture, and to accept this as a vital but also never-ending process of honest academic inquiry, to quote Roundtable. And he calls himself a term technician, and his work linguistic artifacts, in the sense that he navigates through the mountain of data to explore various ways in which democracy is invoked in different linguistic and cultural contexts. And he could have opted for a simpler method, confining himself to a quasi study and contemplating the best form of democracy from nowhere, but his intellectual honesty and academic acumen propelled him to commit to such a close and empirically oriented task. And he defies as he said, he defies the traditional approach to democratic theory, and he calls for an urgent awakening among democratic theorists to the need to attend to the words, forms, and the meanings of democracy, which can potentially diversify and deparacularize the field of democratic theory. And I think there are two senses in which JP's work is particularly valuable. JP's approach is bottom-up, as he takes seriously how democracy is understood in different linguistic contexts. JP reminds us that if we want to make sense of democracy, we should first attend to how it is invoked in words and what their meanings are in the real world. In contrast, democratic theory today is never short of top-down approaches, telling us what democracy is and what the best form, what best universal model should look like. And second and relatedly, his specific method turns Aristotelian essentialism on its head. JP avoids essentializing democracy every step of the way, and leaves open the possibility of how far the meaning of democracy can stretch. After all, not being autocratic or authoritarian doesn't mean that democracy should take a singular, universal, kind of unified form. And JP wants to point us to the vast underexplored space which is left behind by binary tension between different universalistic models of democracy on the one hand and demagogues and populists on the other. Then I have some worries over JP's approach. I'm going to just briefly cover two potential kind of challenges to JP's approach. The first is the possibility that JP and democratic theories of other stripes, including the universalist ones I mentioned, simply talk past one another rather than engage in serious dialogue. For many democratic theorists, what matters is not how the language of democracy is used, say by honeybees, but how to fight for and preserve robust participatory rights, including political participation and associated rights and freedoms, in whatever way these rights are called. It doesn't matter whether you call them democratic rights or not. Perhaps you can simply call them D or P or orange rights. This poses a challenge to JP's approach because exploring diverse ways in which democracy is involved may not directly help to address the pressing issues that these democratic thinkers have in mind. Though enlarging the scope and meaning of democracy will certainly be indirectly helpful in the long run. And I think JP may reply by saying that by coming up with different, even radically so, conceptions and uses of democracy, conventionally marginalized people and their culture, their traditions, can express vastly different moral and political concerns, along with corresponding worldviews and experiences of life. For instance, JP himself mentioned, as he mentioned elsewhere, wall of speakers in Senegal liken their democracy to collective security, and this is no joke. It is therefore not that the participatory rights many democratic theorists have in mind are not important, but that they are subject to different value judgments pertaining to different values and the ranking of values, such that our priority in the case of wall of people in Senegal should be collective security. Then here comes my second worry. Not all meanings of democracy deserve to be treated as equals, even at the exploratory stage. Because what democracy means is something worth fighting for and over. And this reminds me of what Confucius said in the Analects, what matters in politics. First and foremost is the rectification of names. And a lot of people do not randomly choose democracy to denote collective security. They do this for a reason. Bearing the banner of democracy confers new moral status on collective security. After all, China also calls its system whole process democracy because democracy carries special moral and political status that it doesn't want to be disassociated with. Consequently, casting the net wide to see how many uses of democracy there are does not and should not prevent one from endorsing some and criticizing and delegitimizing others. But I think all these are not to challenge Jean-Paul's empirical approach. As he said, his approach is thoroughly exploratory, and he also his approach can also rule out imposter concepts of democracy in the long run. So I fully endorse JP's empirically oriented approach, but perhaps we need to build on his work to ask exactly how empirical understanding can inform a normative discussion of democracy. And here I just briefly propose two options that potentially can help us strike a balance or strike the middle ground between a hyperpluralism of different conceptions of democracy and reducing different democratic conceptions to a single form. So one option, which can be directly built on JP's work, is to look for an overlapping consensus, John Rawls' words, among different conceptions of democracy held by members of a certain community, and look for a common core that can be supported by all in that community. So imposter concepts are ruled out not universally, but within a certain community, and the common kind of overlapping consensus over a common conception of democracy in one community may be different from a consensus in a different community. And the second approach, which I'm adopting, is that we closely look at different cultural communities and see what public values members of a community share, then which involves extensive surveys and data analysis. Then we can proceed to discuss what kind of democracy these values support and whether it is normatively plausible within that cultural context. But either way, I think JP's work is invaluable because the exploratory work can help us understand, can help us just to diversify our normative ideals and see what kind of democratic ideals there are, and then we can, that can serve as a foundation, can serve as a basis for further normative discussion.
Thank you ever so much, Yutang, for your comments and your insights, and I think some very good arguments about how do we balance the breadth with the depth and precision that we might also be needing. So it would be great if people wanted to come on and make comments or ask questions to develop the discussion. Please feel free to just raise your hand. But while people have a think about that, I'll just invite JP to take 30 seconds or so just to respond to any of Yutang's points that were made there.
Super quickly, and Yutang, thank you very much for these provocative thoughts. And the same, I didn't get the chance to thank Petra for that as well. Your point about values-led identification of the democracies through surveys and stats, I think that's really provocative, and I think that's really valuable. Normally what I see is surveys about values to try to identify who's for usually liberal conceptions of democracy, and oftentimes that's done under the guise of the export economy of democratization. So to actually go and map out people's values and then to try to match that set with various different possibilities of democracy could give us a really valuable insight into the nature of democracy, or, as is usually the case, the nature of what people in a specific polity, whatever your boundary was to measure these, to account for these people, what they want from democracy into the future. So it could be a way of trying of actually rather well detailing the wants, the norms of the democracies as exist amongst the population of study. I think that's fantastic. Thank you.
I've got a basic question here, which is about messiness. It strikes me that there's something essentially messy about democracy in both theory and practice, and the degree to which it's ever going to be possible to tie it down in maybe the way you're hoping to through a focus on words. I mean, is the messiness always going to confuse this sort of project?
I'm happy to
go JP.
ask Petra or Yutang to have a crack.
No, yeah, please, if you have a take.
I just saw Petra's message saying yes, and I think the messiness is integral. You know, this never was going to be a project that has an end. Some contributors have pointed out that, you know, language evolves. It's a thing of its own, and the intentions that the authors of words have are often unclear to the authors themselves. You know, and so that is going to constantly be some kind of messy, complex ecology of ideas and intentions and values and wants and desires that's always going to change. And I think that's going to be the touchstone, the wellspring for fresh ideas and possibilities of democracy and conception and practice.
Okay, talking of fresh ideas, here's somebody who's had quite a few and made a big contribution to this literature. Michael Saywood is going to come on and ask a question or make a point. Michael, please do.
Thanks, Matthew. And this probably doesn't align directly with the conversation that's just happening, or does it? I just dropped in a thought into the comments box, partly in response to an earlier comment in the comments box. That Sartori, I always go back to this, Sartori, amongst the other things he offered us, tells us to ask two questions if we're worried about, is this practice democratic? So he asked us the binary question first, you know, is this a democracy or is it not? And secondly, if so, how democratic is it? And I was just trying to think what questions is Jean-Paul's effort and those of others adding to that. And I think there are at least two other questions. How is it democracy? And to whom is it democracy? And there are various different frameworks and ways of carving up what Jean-Paul is doing to try and make sense of it and make it productive. This is one little potential route, I think. I would just add a completely unconnected comment that has occurred to me throughout this conversation, that the continuing death of languages around the world at an alarming rate, linguistic extinction, is a highly relevant factor to the collecting and to the range of things that may be collected in the set of specimens. Thank you for the opportunity of putting the point.
Thank you. And that is a really important point you made about language at the end there. I'm going to move the discussion on and just keep thanking everybody for getting involved, and please feel free to put points in the chat or raise your hand. I'm going to move us now to our final panel member, and to Gergana Dimova, who's going to offer some brief thoughts and provocations. So Gergana, over to you.
Thank you very much, Matthew, and thank you very much, Jean-Paul. Actually, what I'm going to offer is questions, because I think that Jean-Paul's project is potentially a modernizing force in the study of political science, but it would only become so if it's not just a collection of adjectives of democracy, but if it inspires a discussion. And so I think that the people who I should thank most are the people who are right now here, because these are the people who are open-minded and they're interested in how we can move the debate forward, in how we can take advantage of the plethora of adjectives for democracy that Jean-Paul has assessed. And because I know that the real force right now, the ball stops with the people in the chat and their open-mindedness, I don't want to make any specific points. I want to ask them questions. Here on the slide, I kind of try to summarize the pros and cons of Jean-Paul's project. But I want to, because I don't have much time, I want to ask the audience 3 questions. And the third one is, are we ready for a paradigm shift? Are we at a stage where we can take all the adjectives of democracy, have an honest debate, uncover our assumptions, and actually create a science of democracy that is more saleable to the public, but also more transparent amongst ourselves? But let me start with the more low-grade questions. So the way I see Democracy's project, and actually I have never asked Jean-Paul whether he agrees with me, but I think that I describe him as a democratic theorist who has gone rogue, in the sense that he wants to study democracy, so he preserves the object of analysis that democratic theorists have, but he wants to use some of the methods that comparative political scientists have. And I think this, to me, this is a little bit the tension here, whether we can align the object of inquiry of political theory and the methodology of comparative politics, in the sense that he wants more broad comparative analysis. But one way we can look at this debate is to think that comparative politics, if you look at what I consider the Bible of comparative politics research, Designing Social Inquiry by King, Cohen, and Verba, they're saying that comparative politics is about prediction, explanation, and description, with various degrees between these two. But what I'm sensing from the democratic theorists, and I know there are so many here, and so this is one of my sub-questions, is they want to understand what democracy should look like. What is the best normative way for us to create democracy? And I know that, for example, Hans, in his blog post, he said that having a very positivist approach to democracy suppresses the role of the demos. So they want to create democracy. The deliberative project, I think, the participatory project, is partly aspirational and creative. Not entirely, but partly. And so my question is whether we can actually align these aims. Can we have a more aspirational normative approach? And would that approach be stifled by a more positivist approach espoused by the comparative theorists? In my mind, I think that they could be not only aligned, but they could be extremely edifying for each other. Why? The Variety of Democracy project was already mentioned several times. Well, have we ever thought about how the Variety of Democracy takes the insights of people who work on case studies, in other words, country specialists. So I've done the coding as an expert for several countries, and how they transform these types of democracy into degrees of democracy. So they take types of democracy, and probably, it will be interesting to see if they take audience democracy, epistemic democracy, and so on, and how that could be transformed into a degree of democracy. And I think that the interesting question is, what currently is to me is a black box, how that transformation, what is the transformative mechanism through which types of democracy become, points on a scale, free, very free, less democratic, and so on. And I think that this is exactly where political theories could be extremely helpful, because they could tell us how we attribute various weights to the different dimensions of democracy. So, for example, if we have a country which has a lot of freedom of speech, but it doesn't have a lot of horizontal accountability, do we weigh these equally or not? And so my first question is whether these two kind of aspirations of the comparative and the democratic field could be aligned, or do they actually stifle each other? My second question is provoked by something that the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russia, Sergei Lavrov, said recently. He said that the West has used the word democracy to justify a lot of invasions. And he said, and he implied, no, he said actually that democracy is an euphemism. And so I wonder whether we as democratic theorists actually have the obligation to make democracy a word which cannot be classed as a euphemism. And where does, where is the weakness, the vulnerability of democracy, in so that it can be kind of used and abused to the extent that some people could allegedly think that it becomes useless? What is the reason for that? Is the reason, or what is the remedy for this? Could we make democracy less of an euphemism if it is more cohesive? In other words, if we bring our understandings of epistemic, representative, electoral democracy, and Schumpeterian democracy, monetary democracy, and so on, if we bring these together and sort of try to see how they relate to each other, would this contribute to more cohesiveness than then wouldn't allow people to say that democracy is a useless concept? Or is democracy so stretched? I know, Michael Soward, you, Sartori, is democracy so stretched in the sense that it encapsulates every single type of democracy to the extent where it has lost its distinctiveness? Because if you don't exclude anything, it is not very clear what you actually include. So this is my second question. How do we deal with this question of euphemisms?
Just 1 minute left, Gergana.
Oh, okay. Very quickly then. My third kind of worry is, or kind of question, is whether actually we've been honest enough with ourselves in terms of stating openly and comparing our assumptions. I mean, I'm not saying that, political theories of all stripes are kind of intentionally burying their assumptions. If you look at Kuhn and scientific paradigms, he says that all paradigms have assumptions. People just take certain methodologies or beliefs about the world for granted. And this is for the sake of specificity and efficiency, because you don't want to discover the hot water over and over again. My problem is that if we study democracy in parallel tracks, you know, everybody in their own subfield, journals, offices, and so on, study them in parallel tracks, whether we kind of lose sight of the assumptions that we had at the beginning. And it seems to me that right now there is we're in stage 1 of studying democracy, where the visibility of the assumptions that we have is very small. And I think that comparison is good because the comparative method kind of forces people to come to terms, to be more conscious and more open about the assumptions underlying the models. And from and in terms of messiness, you know, messiness was mentioned. I think that we could be, or Jean-Paul's project is a good way for us to maybe consider a paradigm shift, but that being in a state where you consider a paradigm shift is extremely unsettling. Again, Kuhn says that science, our science, the theory of democracy, possesses inbuilt mechanism that ensures the relaxation of the restrictions that bound research whenever the paradigm from which they derive ceases to function effectively. So I think that we need to really ask ourselves whether we want that paradigm to function more effectively. And by that, I mean not to annihilate our assumptions. I don't think annihilating our assumptions is a good thing. I'm finishing this, my last sentence. Not annihilating the assumptions, but making them transparent and discussing them. I think that will be to the service. And then if we want to change them, we will be in a position of a paradigm shift. But I think that what needs to happen is for people not only to accumulate the taxonomies that Jean-Paul has collected, but also to try to relate them to each other. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for that, Gergana. I wonder if anybody just in our last few minutes would like to come on and make any final points, suggestions or questions, particularly around the future of this debate and discussion and where it might go next. Just while people do that, I wondered if, JP, do you have any responses or thoughts quickly in response to some of Gergana's comments there?
I thought the last slide, just off the top of my head, was really provocative in terms of us doing more. And here I think about a lot of the work in the 2000s and the 90s, when you take your pick, any massive journal of political science, however you want to define that, and you look at all of the articles that use the word democracy in it. Few of them, there'll be the minority that actually go through and tell the reader what it is they mean by this. And typically the word is given as a signal that this is actually a variable in a survey or a quantitative study, and its meaning is obscured or is assumed on the part of the readership that, you know, everyone's on the same page about it. So having that level of transparency, you know, basically making our disclaimers and not taking the word for granted would, as Gergana said, be, I think, very, very valuable in our work if all of us did this and were much more attuned to that. Thank you.
Petra, Yutang, I wondered if you would like to come in with any concluding comments or thoughts from this discussion.
Yeah, but actually, I just a quick comment, perhaps a kind of clarificatory question for Gergana, what she just said. I like the idea of comparison. I think it's a great idea. But let's say that, well, concept 1 democracy, it has 2 assumptions, assumption 1 and assumption 2. And concept 2 democracy, it has assumptions 3 and 4. And they have completely different assumptions. If we do comparison, at least we are assuming that they share some common benchmark in terms of which we can do comparison. But if they don't share any common assumptions, how can we go about doing comparison?
Okay, I'm going to come to Petra, please, if I can, just to make sure we finish on time and allow Petra to come back in. Petra.
Yeah, thank you. And so what I want to say is just two things. One is that in Sartori's comparing and miscomparing, just to Yutang, Sartori says that we are perfectly fine comparing apples and pears as long as we are aware we are comparing apples and pears. And that they are distinct from stones. If I recall exactly the little passage from some Sartori, so that is one thing. And what I would like to say, thank you to everybody, thank you to Jean-Paul, and I want to say that join us, the water is fine on this side, and yeah, it's a chaos, but chaos can be very freeing. It offers you to just open your mind, and we are limited by our imagination, but also should always be aware that what is happening outside of our comfortable ivory towers. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's a really interesting point to finish on, the notion of slight discomfort being in many ways constructive or provocative. It's just gone 5:30. I think the standard of this discussion has been shown by the way we've had such good numbers staying with us until 5:30 on a Friday. So I will just conclude things by thanking Jean-Paul, thanking all the members of our panel today, and particularly thanking everybody online who's watched the seminar. But the big thing is, this is a conversation that will continue. If you would like to pitch to make another contribution to the online debate, then please feel free to do so. The ECPR is very keen to publish more contributions in this space. Thank you very much and have a really great weekend. I'll say goodbye to everybody. Goodbye.